Hello, and welcome back to The Hatch. I'm Sammy Roth.
And I'm Rosie Murphy, and this is the podcast where we talk about Lost.
We are watching Season 3, Episode 15, Left Behind. It is a Kate episode. It is the episode where Kate and Juliet spend much of the episode handcuffed together in the jungle.
We also have a little bit more from Sammy's conversation with Ivan Askwith, a TV producer who has written and researched quite a bit about Lost.
Let's get into the episode.
As always, we begin each episode of The Hatch with hot takes. Sammy, what is your hot take on Left Behind?
Oh boy, so lot to discuss this episode. Kind of hard to pick out a hot take because there's so much happening. I think what I want to go with is that Saeed appears for 60 seconds in this episode. And by the end of those 60 seconds, I was already, as always, saying, thank goodness for Saeed for being
I felt exactly the same way.
I know, because it's like, really, Jack, you're just going to trust Juliet after all of that, and Kate's just going to go along with it because she doesn't want you to be mad at her? Thank God for Saeed for voicing the obvious of, we can't trust her, we can't bring her along with us. I mean, he loses, but my God. Well,
and also Saeed for actually, checking the other houses, checking the perimeter.
That as well.
Seeing if everyone is telling the truth. Just a little bit of basic, trust but verify here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Saeed
thank goodness.
Gets the MVP nod in the last minute of this one after
as
all
usual.
That. What we are of course the vice president of Saeed Incorporated. What is your hot take, Rosie?
Oh gosh. So when John Locke comes to explain to Kate that
I want you to know I made a strong case for you. I told them that you were a good person, reliable, smart, honest. And then they told me who you were and what you had done. Let's just say forgiveness isn't one of their strong suits.
Really? Come on. That just seems like such a dumb excuse. And that's the reason they gave for not bringing Kate, is that she blew up her abusive stepfather and is on the run from the law. All of the others have done some shit, as we know.
I mean, Locke has done some shit. Also
had some shit done to him, but...
Yeah, I'm just thinking of Boone here.
Oh, well, yeah, that too. On the island has done quite a bit of shit. Yeah, I don't know. I was just come on, guys. If you don't want to take Kate, you don't have to give a reason. You're the others. Your birthright is to be mysterious. But, yeah, I don't know. I was very skeptical of that.
I think this is part of the fact that Ben doesn't really know what the fuck is going on with the island or with Jacob, and it's just feeding people bullshit all the time to make it seem like he has a plan and knows what he's doing. It makes me think of when Pickett said about Jack earlier, he's not even on Jacob's list. And in reality, we know Jack is on. Course. He is a candidate. So is Kate.
And so is Kate.
And in fact, what Jacob tells them later on is that he picked them as candidates because they were flawed like him.
Right.
So this not only is Ben full of shit. I think that what he tells Locke here is actually the opposite of what's going on.
Right. Right. And Locke just parrots it. I mean, I guess Locke still doesn't really know very much about the others at this point.
No.
And does assume that they have more information than him and this direct line to the island. Although I guess that faith is shaking a bit based on his recent encounter with Ben. But yeah, I don't know.
But no, that's what I think is happening.
Okay.
And I love by the way when Kate looks at him like he's insane and says, "Are you brainwashed?" Because yes. Yes, he is.
Yes, correct, but also speaking for the whole audience there, which is fun.
Absolutely.
Can I bring up another that's just a small axe I have to grind here?
Please grind your axe.
So this is very nearly an all-woman Lost episode. The primary action of the episode is Kate and Juliet in the jungle. The primary action of the flashback is Kate and Cassidy, and Kate's mom. And Hurley and Sawyer pop up, and there's some other stuff. But this is very nearly an all-woman cast, and yet both plots are about men. Kate and Juliet are fighting about Jack the whole time.
Yeah.
And Kate and Cassidy are complaining about, the man who we find out is Sawyer, and of course Kate's abusive stepfather, and I was just I don't know. Are you familiar with the Bechdel test?
Yes, that to pass the Bechdel test, you need to have two women in a scene talking about something that's not a man.
Yeah. And I was just like, oh, we got close. We got close. Yeah, that's all.
That actually, I mean, so one of the questions I have, though, about this episode, again, so much to talk about, but just to start with the flashbacks. So I love the interaction. I mean, I love Kate and Cassidy helping each other.
Too.
I think that's just a great relationship. The scene where, well, two things. One, when Kate says to her mom, she says, "I have nothing to be sorry for." She says, "I'm not sorry." Mm-hmm. Which one reminded me of actually the moment with Mr. Echo earlier this year, right before his death, where he insists to the smoke monster incarnation of his brother that, I have nothing to apologize for. I've done what I think is right. I love the defiance of that.
Right.
But do you think that Kate's mom has a point when she says to Kate,
"You can't help who you love, Catherine. And for good or bad, I loved him. And you burnt him alive. You turned on the gas and you lit a match. You murdered him in cold blood. I did it for you. No. What you did for yourself."
is that fair? Is that unfair? I've been thinking about that really hard since we watched the episode, and I just don't have a good answer for it.
That's an interesting question. We know that the stepfather was an alcoholic. We know that he abused Kate's mom, and it's insinuated that he also abused or tried to abuse Kate.
Yeah.
In some previous flashbacks. So I think it's probably both. I think Kate hates and has every right to hate this man, of her own volition. But the stuff that he did to her mom, and probably, I wonder if there's an undercurrent here of part of the reason Kate hates him so much is that her mom does not hate him.
Yeah.
She's so repulsed by him and so frustrated by what he's done that she almost, and as a subsidiary kind of frustration with her mom for not hating him, she needs to hate him double or something. She needs to act on behalf of her mom because her mom can't. You know what I mean?
That's really interesting.
I think we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Where there's this whole build-up to revealing what Kate did and who she killed and why she's on the run. And you kind of get to a place of, I kind of agree. I kind of think she was justified. And I'm always very, very confused in the Kate flashbacks because I don't know if my inclination is to sort of take Kate's side in the whole thing. And I don't know how to feel about the fact that, the show, the narrative arc has, set her up to be, oh, she did something horrible and she's on the run, because it doesn't seem all that horrible.
I mean, to be fair, it's a murder. But I agree with you generally. I mean, I think it's a similar conversation to the one that we've already sort of started to have pre-Anthony Cooper's murder.
Yeah.
Where it feels like, it's very justified. This is someone who, and I say this as someone who doesn't even really believe in the death penalty, but Anthony Cooper definitely seems like he deserves to die for the things that he's done.
He's definitely, I don't feel a lot of sympathy for him, for sure.
Yeah.
And same with Kate's stepfather.
Right, even though we don't get quite as much, we don't get to see quite as much of him and the bad things he's done as we do with Anthony Cooper, but it just feels like a similar situation where it's we're supposed to know that murdering people is bad, but also maybe this is fine.
Right, or maybe it's not as bad as it's made out to be.
Yeah. Which is why it's so, it's so painful to see what it does to Kate and her mother. I mean, it's just really...
Well, yeah, and in the flashback when her mother says, the next time, if I ever see you again, I will scream bloody murder until someone comes and gets you. Of course, Kate goes to see her when she's dying, and that's exactly what happens. And presumably, like, several years pass in that time. And so she carries this, it appears that she never forgives Kate.
And actually, I mean, this is sort of a hindsight, but one of the things that I ultimately end up loving about this storyline is the resolution when Kate gets off the island, where she does go on trial, and her mom is supposed to testify against her, and then ultimately doesn't do it and spares Kate. And I don't think she really forgives her, but because I think it's this whole thing where Diane wants to have a relationship with Aaron and wants to see Aaron, who she thinks is her grandson, and Kate just won't do it. And despite that, even though Kate won't do that for her, she refuses to take the stand at the end of the day, and Kate gets off free. So it is gratifying that that's where it ultimately goes. Like, I don't want to be too mad at Diane for doing what she felt like she had to do, but I think that that's the right decision in the end.
No, you're right. And I think it shows at least that Diane has evolved somewhat in her thinking. Like, she may not have forgiven Kate, but she doesn't think that she deserves to go to prison for the rest of her life, or to go to prison for several decades, or whatever is possible that day.
I will say that despite the failure to pass the Bechdel test, I thought that the whole sort of like argument here over, Jack and whether Jack would want them to come back. I guess especially the moment where Juliet sort of calls out Kate and says, you came, tells her why Jack, really didn't want her to come back, because he saw Kate and Sawyer on the monitors, and then, sort of like blames Kate for coming back anyway and stopping her from getting off the island. I thought that was actually one of the most compelling dramatic moments that has ever resulted from the Jack, Sawyer, Kate, Juliet love quadrangle. Like, I thought their arguments were actually interesting. Like, there was...
I did not.
Oh, please, tell me why.
I just thought, like... So when Juliet initially brings up Jack, Kate gets so mad so quickly.
Yeah.
Which really took me by surprise. And then they get into this really violent fight. And I was just like, I don't know. I mean, I know Kate is frustrated, especially having gone back to try to save Jack, and Jack doesn't seem to want to be saved. And then, he ends up not getting off the island anyway. And we find out later on that Kate really blames herself for that, that he would have gotten off the island if... Which
I have a problem with, but we can get to that.
Yeah, I understand where she's at in her head, like, oh, well, I'm the one who initiated this, like, rescue mission, and if we hadn't done that, Locke could never have blown up the submarine. I think Ben still would have found a way to not let them off the island, but,
But how was Kate supposed to know any of that?
Right.
And I think it's pretty gross that Jack just, like, doesn't even say anything. Like, he lets her blame herself, and he seems to blame her, too.
Right, which irks me. But yeah, and then, Juliet tells us at the end that, oh, well, yeah, I had the handcuff key all along. I wanted to make you think that we were in this together. And I was like, you did a terrible job of that.
Yeah.
At no point did Kate think for a second that you were in this together. She hates you, and is justified in that, I think, because Juliet did participate in keeping her in a cage and making her do hard labor, and
as Kate reminds her,
no reason they should want to be buddies. But I was very kind of confused by all of the different threads happening there.
So I agree with you that Juliet's excuses are lame, and I mean, we know from hindsight, right, that and it feels obvious anyway. Knowing it in hindsight. Yeah, this is all a setup by Ben. Yeah. I mean, Juliet says Ben likes to play mind games. She kind of lays the whole thing out for Kate right there.
Right.
So the fact that it just becomes so easy at the end because Jack just inherently trusts her anyway is kind of unfortunate. Yeah. Because, as you said, she seems to have no success in convincing Kate, especially after she has to reveal the lie at the end to escape from the smoke monster.
Right.
I think the thing that I found compelling about it still is that for Juliet, the stakes are real. Like, she was about to get off the island, and as a result, of Kate, unknowingly, but as a result of, Kate's actions and Juliet feeling like Kate had done something she wasn't supposed to do, Juliet really did end up stuck on the island. So for Juliet, I think, despite the fact that it's a setup, that fury and her frustration with Kate are very, very real.
Yeah.
So I think that when Juliet is, like, trashing Kate about...
I hope you're not dragging me all the way back there with you for him. Excuse me? I hope you're not going back for Jack. Because I was standing right there when he told you not to come back. And now that you've ruined his chance to get off the island...
I don't know, that's why I felt like it was, at the very least, there was something compelling coming out of this, love quadrangle thing. Like, it wasn't really related to the relationship part of it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's what frustrated me about that plotline is that, like, Jack doesn't need to be in this at all. Like, Kate and Juliet have plenty of beef with each other.
Okay.
Without bringing Jack into it.
That's fair.
And I get that Jack is the reason Kate is here, like, geographically. She went back for him and got captured, and, like, okay. But all of this is happening, her anger at Juliet, going back to Juliet keeping her captive, has nothing to do with Jack. Juliet's anger at Kate doesn't, has maybe a small amount to do with some romantic jealousy, but, like, I don't know. I was just like, I think we're giving Jack way too much credit here.
You're changing my opinion here. I think I'm with you.
I of course, not Jack's number one fan, so I apologize if this is an unpopular take.
No,
but
I mean,
I just think it could have been, like, I would have been a lot more convinced if we had just, like, left Jack out of it, or left Jack for later.
Right, they could have had the plot device of going back to rescue Jack and kind of just, like, not been arguing about him the whole time.
Well, and I guess, there's a bit of a payoff here to Kate is finally finding out that Jack knows about her and Sawyer, and
right.
I didn't realize she didn't know that yet, but it makes sense.
I thought that was a strong moment.
It was, and that's a bit of an oh shit moment for Kate when she realizes, like, oh, that might be part of what's going on here, and part of why, Jack wasn't delighted to see me, a few days ago when I showed up.
Yeah.
But it just seems like you said, the stakes are so real for Juliet, and the stakes are so real for Jack, and
for Kate.
And for Kate. And they just seem so much higher than the love quadrangle. I don't know. Yeah,
no, you're making me realize that the things that I enjoyed about this plot actually had nothing to do with that, so thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
Jack is such a jerk at the end, I think.
Kate is who? To Kate?
To Kate. She's, like, bawling and apologizing, and it's like, I know Jack's mad he didn't get off the island, but how the fuck was Kate supposed to know?
Right, Kate only did what Jack would have done in this situation. No way Jack leaves Kate and Saeed to be captured by the others. Yeah. And at the end of the day, John blew up the submarine. We have a common enemy here, and it's John Locke.
Right, which we'll get to.
Right. But. And I get, we're trying to set up sort of a Jack, Juliet, Kate love triangle, and that's fine. But yeah, it's just not my favorite.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I still kind of like Jack and Juliet better than Jack and Kate. People are going to shoot me for saying that. But at the moment, that's how I feel, and Juliet will be much better with Sawyer. But do you have any hindsights?
I think just next week's episode is going to give us a ton to talk about, because all of the information about Juliet will fill in all of the gaps that I think kind of leave us dissatisfied in this episode.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to that. How about you?
Well, I blew 2 of my 3 hindsights already, but one more in reserve, which is that another thing that continues when Kate gets off the island is the relationship between Kate and Cassidy.
Yeah.
Which is really lovely. And we didn't talk too much about this, but it's just, even though they're both complaining about guys, the whole sort of one girl helping another thing here that one of them references, like,
yeah,
it's very sweet, it's very affirming, and I'm glad that they can continue to be part of each other's lives post-Island.
Well, and it's fun in that flashback, right? Because they sort of instinctively recognize one another as con women. And the friendship is on very, very interesting terms. Like, Cassidy goes to great lengths for Kate in this flashback without even knowing her real name, and it's understood that she's just not going to know her real name. And then, of course, Kate tells her in the end, but they're just willing to do really incredible things for each other, which is kind of cool.
It is, and I think, even though Kate isn't, doing something for Cassidy, the level of trust she shows in her, she admits to this woman she's just met that she committed a murder and is on the run from the law, and
right.
that's big. And she just kind of feels it, like, oh, I can trust her, and so.
Right.
There is I think some give and take and some evenness in the relationship because of that as well.
Right. Well, and it's also interesting to see that Cassidy, having been conned and abandoned by Sawyer, continues to lead a life of crime. Seems to have been put down this path by her relationship with Sawyer.
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
Yeah, I guess because he took all of her money and she needs cash, but yeah, I don't know. Just interesting to see how the impact he had on her in many ways.
Yeah. When Sawyer gets off the island at the end of the show, Cassidy's still going to be out there with his daughter. That story is unfinished.
And all that money Sawyer put into that account for her.
Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Should we get to the Ivan Askwith?
Yeah, I think so. So we started this interview last week. Ivan Askwith is a TV producer, has been described as a quote-unquote fan whisperer, who did quite a bit of academic work on Lost when it was airing, and has gone on to work in the industry. Let's play it.
Do you think that, and there are like 6 different things that you talked about that I want to pull out, so I'll try to take them one by one. But, the Dickens thing I find really interesting in terms of just how well-regarded Dickens is today, and I'm sure you don't have people picking up his novels for the first time and, having that complaint, oh, this feels like he's making it up as he goes along, like you would have known at the time if that was, the focus of how the structure of the narrative was being created. Mm-hmm. Do you think with Lost, for people who might pick it up today outside of the context of following along week by week, trying to guess, people who pick it up in 10 years and just binge straight through. Do you think that is that now a fundamentally different experience where maybe some of those problems fade away, where you don't have that same focus on do they know what they're doing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and there are a bunch of ways I could answer that. I do think that shows get watched differently once you can watch them all at once. I think you even hear people say about shows like Lost, about shows like Battlestar Galactica, it's a pretty different thing. Like, the things that bothered you if you had watched it in real time won't bother you as much if you watch it all at once. And part of that's because when you have a minute or 30 seconds or 5 seconds between episodes, rather than a week of speculation and time to rile yourself up and speculate on every detail you just saw and what it might mean, some things stand out more and some things stand out less, right? Like, things that seem like they're asking you to think about them, you don't have time to think about them before you go on to the next episode, and it either does or doesn't get resolved. But it's not like a ton of your time, weeks or months or years of your life, have been quote-unquote wasted speculating on something that didn't turn out to pay off.
You don't spend 6 months waiting to find out what happens after Juliet blows the bomb. You just
exactly.
Turn to the next page and
you may like the answer, you may not like the answer, but at least you won't feel like someone wasted your time in the same way that fans who were watching in real time might have. The funny thing about that is, you watch shows that come out. The biggest change, I think, since I wrote this chapter in 2009 maybe, is we've entered a Netflix culture, right? Where binge viewing is no longer something that happens eventually. It's something that happens from the moment of release. And shows come out with entire seasons intact. And I think it changes the structure of shows. It changes the expectations we have of shows. And it also changes how we talk about shows with each other, because, I think a show like Lost, ironically, would not have been nearly as satisfying or gotten the traction it did if it came out with every season dropping all at once like Netflix.
Oh, I'm totally with you on that. The fun of speculating and waiting and discussing is all gone.
Exactly. And it's funny, right? When Netflix kind of was really starting its binge culture, I remember I was in a meeting with a company I was consulting for the Monday morning after they had released the second season of House of Cards, right? And everyone was talking about it because it was a thing. House of Cards season 1 had become a big thing. But the first thing the person running the meeting said is, "Hey, who watched House of Cards this weekend?" And everyone held their hand up. And then he said, "Okay, what episode is everyone on?" And he went around and it was like 1, 3, 5, 1, 2, 7, 5, 1, 3. And he's like, "Okay, nobody talk about it. We don't want to ruin it for each other."
Interesting.
And in that moment, I was like, oh man, if your answer the Monday morning after you get to see a new show is nobody talk about it, that's the death of a certain kind of fan culture, right? You know, and I don't think most Netflix shows manage to gain the kind of fandom that Lost had because they don't give the fandom time to gel and bond with each other over that act of collective speculation. But what that brings us back to is the idea that if collective speculation isn't paid off with kind of an answer that plays by the rules, then it can sour the entire taste and experience for people.
Well, and this is something else I wanted to get into. I mean, in terms of just the things that the folks running the show did to encourage that, and all of the clues they dropped, and everything happens for a reason mantra. Do you think is there a way that they could have made the show, or could they have done things differently in the way they made it or promoted it that would have, I guess, lessened or diminished that sort of ultimate disappointment or controversy surrounding the finale, where not everything was tied up in a neat bow? Or was that stuff so inherent to the experience of what made the show great that it's kind of you can't have your cake and eat it too. You kind of have to have one or the other.
Sure. Well, it's hard to Monday morning quarterback it and guess how
it
might have played. Obviously, to know how it might have played out. And that's not to say.
But it just makes me think. It just makes me think the stuff that you're talking about that ultimately led to a lot of disappointment is also a lot of the stuff that made it so much fun.
That made it good. Well, that's the interesting thing, right? Like what I was going to say is, I have a lot of sympathy for the writers and creators of the show for a couple reasons. One is that they didn't. As I talked about in the chapter in the book 10 years ago, one of the things they couldn't do that even Dickens was allowed to do was decide when the story was going to end. Until the end of the third season, they were just told, "We'll tell you every year if you've got a new one." And as Lindelof said at one point, we could have told them, "Well, we're going to do 3 seasons and then we're done." And they could have said, "That's great, you can be done, but we're going to hire someone else and they're going to take over the show and keep it going until we don't want it anymore." And one of the most significant things about Lost was that it was actually, I think, the first network show to negotiate an end date multiple seasons in advance while it was still popular, not just because the writers wanted it, but because I think everyone involved started realizing that if they couldn't make a promise to the audience about how much longer this story was going to go on for, and they couldn't write the story knowing what ending they needed to work towards, they were going to keep bleeding viewers every season, and more people were going to write off the entire thing as an exercise in kind of, red herrings and navel-gazing. And so the writers, I don't think the writers are really to blame for the way the audience interpreted it. I think that's in large part the work of marketing. Like the season, I don't remember if it was season 3 or season 4, there was a poster that came out in all of the advertisements for one season of the show. When it came back, the tagline of the advertising was "Everything happens for a reason." And having now worked in marketing, outside of the central creative room where a show is being decided on, I know what it's kind of like to be handed a show and say, okay, well, my job is to figure out the best way to get people to want to watch this. And I probably would have seized on a phrase like that too. Like, of course, if everything happens for a reason, then you're never going to want to miss an episode because you might miss something that's happening for a reason and you might be missing an important clue. The problem is, it's not clear that the writers ever meant to continue making that promise over and over to the audience outside of the show. On the show, John Locke was the one who originally, I think, said that phrase, that everything happens for a reason.
Right. We were all brought here for a reason.
Exactly. And that's, when you're a writer creating a show, it's fine for a character to say something like that if the character believes it, and that's not the same as you making a promise to the audience that he's right? Like, when you're speaking through the voice of one character and there's another character in the next second saying, "No, John, not everything happens for a reason. Maybe we're just here because we have terrible luck," that sort of thing. That's what a writer's allowed to do. They can have a character who's stating a philosophy that isn't standing in as the philosophy of the entire show and how you should watch it. But when a marketer runs an advertisement out of context that says everything happens on this show for a reason, then you're making a promise to the audience that maybe the writers never meant to. And I guarantee you the writers and producers, They probably signed off on that phrase, but if the marketing team had wanted to use it and the writers hadn't liked it, it still would have happened, right? Like, so it's interesting because there's so, unlike a Dickens novel where one person writes it and maybe a few people edit it and then print it, a TV show is the collaboration of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, many of whom never even meet each other. Like, the marketing team of that show probably never met the majority of the people involved in that show. Yet they made decisions about the way that most audience members would first encounter the show and what kind of frame would be put on it about what the show was going to offer them. That's a scary thing for a writer, and I don't know that they had a lot of control over it. But I also know that, you know, the marketers who did that at the time probably felt like, well, the show seems to be saying that, so we're probably safe saying that. We don't, you know, they didn't know where anyone was going. It's not like the marketers were briefed on how the show was going to end, obviously. So they didn't know whether they were making a promise that couldn't be kept. They just thought, oh, this seems like a show where the fun thing about it is that everything happens for a reason, so let's focus on that fact because people will definitely watch. But yeah, I think the show kind of existed in a moment where there was no real way for them to get around that promise getting made, but it may not have been a fair expectation for the show to create in people.
I'll ask you one more unfair question, and then I'll try to move back to more fair questions.
No.
But
I like unfair questions.
How do you think they did on living up to that promise? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff that was controversial. There are things that some fans, you know, are upset they didn't answer. But, you know, on the whole, having watched the show, you know, how much do you think they lived up to that promise versus, you know, sort of inevitable failures because not everything was explainable?
Well, it's interesting, right? Like, in retrospect, I remember how the show ended. I remember what the final episode was about. I do not remember how they got there. And when I looked back over the last day or two at the Wikipedia and Lostpedia entries, it boggled my mind what they somehow managed to make feel like it was somehow coherent while I was watching the show at the time. Because you read it now and you're like, what is this garbage? Like, it went all over the place. All this stuff happened. Threads were abandoned. New things were introduced at the last minute. Like, I think when you started watching the show in the first season or two, if someone had told you where the show was going to be by its end, you'd be like, what are you talking about? That makes no sense. That's not what this show is. I don't think so.
Sure.
So it's hard to say, right? Like, I remember that in the end, I was more or less okay with the resolution to the main question, which is, where are these people? Are they dead? What happened? But I can't tell you if I was satisfied with how they got there. I remember at the time tentatively being willing to follow them, and I don't think there was any moment that made me kind of throw my remote across the room and say, that's it, we're done here. But it didn't stick with me. 10 years later, I have no idea what the plot of that show was. I just remember the one kind of basic point of how it ended.
I think to me, I'm sort of I'm a Lost obsessive, obviously. I do this podcast. I've rewatched the show. I generally know how things went. I think the point you made a few minutes ago when you referenced Twin Peaks is really valuable, that once Twin Peaks resolved, and I haven't seen Twin Peaks, I have to acknowledge here, but the point that once they resolved their main mystery of who killed Laura Palmer, that they had trouble figuring out where to go after that, that just makes me think of a lot of how I felt about, the moments when Lost actually did answer questions, that sometimes it was actually getting the answer was not especially satisfying, and that asking the question was more satisfying. I think you sort of say that to an extent in your essay, and I'm just curious, agree or disagree with that, and sort of, is there a way they could have even answered all these questions that really would have been satisfying, or would that just have been disappointing in its own way?
Probably not, right? Like, I mean, what we've learned in an era of internet TV culture is there's no, Game of Thrones showed us that someone's going to guess every possible ending, and there is no ending that everyone's going to like, because everyone's going to start having pet theories, and someone is going to think that whatever choice you make is the worst choice you possibly could have made. And if you're unlucky, a critical mass of people are going to think that you made the worst possible choices, which seems to be the situation that at the moment Game of Thrones finds itself in. But I think... oh man, can you ask me the question one more time? I lost the thread for a second.
That's okay. The question was generally asking, could they have answered questions in a way that actually satisfied people, or was this just a doomed endeavor because answering questions is inherently less satisfying than asking them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any way they could have answered most of their questions that would have satisfied a majority of the audience. And even Lindelof said that at one point, right? He was asked if they would ever say what the numbers mean, and he said, I couldn't imagine ever telling you what the numbers mean, because how could we possibly do that? What answer could anybody give you that would in any way be satisfying at this point? So one question is whether they set themselves up in a way that they could have avoided by putting so much emphasis on the questions. It's one thing to pose a question and then keep moving, and it's another through repetition to keep making a question central over and over and over again, like they did with the recurrence of the numbers that Hurley was obsessed with, right? Had that been a throwaway detail, it might not have bothered people. But when it seems more and more like what you're saying is this is a central mystery of the show, and you don't have an answer that at least you believe in, that you want to stand behind, that feels satisfying to you, then you're sort of setting yourself up, I think, for a letdown with the audience. The other thing that I think is interesting about your question, and the thing that I, in retrospect, didn't touch on at all in that chapter that I don't even know if it had been stated publicly or if it came later. The thing I now most wish that I had included was, that Lost was in part, even though he wasn't actively involved, J.J. Abrams was sort of the point of genesis of the show with Lindelof. And Abrams has famously given a TED Talk about the idea of the mystery box and the idea that the wondering and the not knowing to him is far more magical than any answer you could give, right? And so that he thinks that what's exciting is to wonder what's in the box, not to find out what's in the box. And I agree with that. The problem is that works really well in some kinds of stories and not as well in others. When you have a mystery, like a detective, a murder mystery, to say, well, it doesn't matter who committed the murder. What matters is the excitement of wondering who committed the murder. I don't think so. I think there are certain scenarios where most of the pleasure you're getting out of wondering is from knowing that you'll be able to line up your theory with the eventual answer and see if you were right or not. There are ways to ask questions where the wondering is all that matters. There are monsters that you don't ever have to show but can insinuate, like the smoke monster, that can be exciting and are probably more exciting right up till the moment where you put them on screen, which most horror directors know that what you show is never as scary as what you don't show. But I think in the years since Lost, a lot of people have kind of come to view Abrams' fascination with the mystery box as a little bit of a cop-out and a skepticism, right? Like there's one way of thinking about it is that it's exciting and he's right that those are fun things to wonder about, and another is to say, yeah, but that's also you abdicating your responsibility as a storyteller to have a punchline to your own joke or an answer to your own riddle. And I don't want to waste my time on a joke that has no punchline or a riddle that has no answer. So I think, Lost became one of the first big object lessons in it. And it's funny because I helped organize a conference a few years after Lost ended called the Story World Conference, which was for transmedia discussion and storytelling. And Damon Lindelof had just finished working on Prometheus, which had come out, the Alien prequel. And yeah, and he gave a keynote and then took some questions afterwards. And someone asked him, what do you think your biggest weakness is as a storyteller? And he said, come on, you all, I think Prometheus had taken the same criticism as Lost, and he said, you all know what my biggest weakness is. I apparently can't stick the landing. I can't give you an ending to the story that's as satisfying as everything that led up to it. And it's funny because I haven't seen The Leftovers yet, but I've heard that he then went on to do The Leftovers, which a lot of people say has one of the best endings of any television series in the past 10 or 15 years. So maybe he's been learning how to get better at it, but I think he would tell you at the time that he just had no idea how to deliver an answer that was going to satisfy anybody.
I will say that I watched The Leftovers last year, and
no spoilers. I haven't seen it.
No spoilers, but I will say that it has what I thought was a very satisfying ending. After some iffy moments at the beginning of the final season, so if you are watching The Leftovers and you feel kind of dissuaded, stick with it because the ending is really quite beautiful.
I think despite what Ivan said about the JJ mystery box thing maybe being a cop-out, I kind of feel like I really stand by the point that I made in the conversation that when Lost answered questions, it was generally, not that satisfying. Like, the one that always gets me is the Whispers. The reveal in season 6 that the Whispers were like people who had died on the island and couldn't move on. We see Michael again.
Right.
And I remember being super underwhelmed by that. And frankly, the reveal even that the smoke monster is like the Man in Black is not that satisfying. I'm much more into the smoke monster when it's this mysterious primal island force rather than a dude who died and became a demon.
And resents his brother.
and resents his brother. Like, I don't know. I mean, not that everything they did was unsatisfying, but just when they really got at, like, the big long-term, island mysteries, it just, it's really hard to bring those home in a way that truly, stands up to the level of mystery and coolness that you've built into them.
Yeah, and I have to wonder if any answer would have really been satisfying.
Yeah.
Like, whatever ended up being the answer for the Whispers or for the Smoke Monster or for John Locke's miraculous healing or whatever, like, because the mystery was so fun, I just don't know what kind of an answer could have been more satisfying than the mystery itself, which is a really tough position for writers to be in.
You can always send us your hot take if you want to contribute to the conversation here on The Hatch. Tell us what you think of the week's episode. Tell us what you think of our takes. Talk about unrelated things as long as they're still Lost-related. Call us, 954-6-DHARMA. That's +1 954-6-DHARMA, and leave a message.
We are also on Facebook.com/The Hatch Podcast and on Twitter @TheHatchPodcast. You can communicate with us on both of those platforms.
And we will be back next week, of course. We'll be watching Season 3, Episode 16, One of Us, and as we said, getting more into the true story of what's happening with Juliet here.
I'm super excited to get our second Juliet flashback, including a bunch of on-island stuff that we don't know yet. So I think that'll feel a lot more satisfying than this week did. We will also have a little bit more from Ivan Askwith on these same topics.
And we would love it if you could rate us and review us on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you download the show on. It helps people find us, it builds the audience, and we love it when people listen. So rate and review and let us know what you think of the show.
Our theme music is by Andy G. Cohen, and our cover art is by Danny Roth.
We'll be back next week.
Namaste.